Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. Kiddos in the room, y'all come on down. Mr. CJ over here's got some bags for you. Y'all come grab one of those bags and head on back to your seats. It's good to see y'all this morning. Man, I'm so grateful for our student band leading us in worship today. Aren't you glad? Yeah. I love seeing adults respond in worship to those who are younger than them leading them. It really just magnifies who we are as a body as we push our students to the forefront, give them opportunity to lead, because we know that once they multiply out from here, they're going to change the world. And we're grateful to give them opportunity to do it, and we're grateful to get to worship under their leadership. So students, thank you guys very, very much for your leadership today. Speaking of kiddos and teenagers and all that, something that's a fun thing that we do as a family every now and then is tell stories. Everybody loves a good story. And my crew, whenever we sit around the dinner table, as they were growing up, my bride, she would capture little phrases and stuff that they would say. As you know, kids, they say the darndest things kind of deal, right? And as they would say these phrases, Rachel would write them down. We got this little green book that every now and then it goes say, hey, will you tell us some stories of whenever we were little? And we'll just read those phrases and tell the stories behind them. And we have a great time doing that. You know, one story that as I was getting ready for today that kept recurring in my mind was the day that we found out that we were going to have twins. And so it was a remarkable day. We knew that Rachel was pregnant, so we were going to have the sonogram, and we were to make sure everything was good and the heartbeat was there and everything. And we were sitting there in the room, and the guy that was doing the sonogram, he's sitting there and he's just talking to us, and it's going great. And all of a sudden he goes, "Oh, look, there's two." And we were like, "Two of what?" Because we were ready, 2 eyeballs, 2 ears, 2 arms, 2 legs, that kind of thing. There's some normal twos that you look for. He goes, "No, there's 2 babies." And in that moment, there was this noise that came out of my wife that I had never heard before, and nor have I ever heard since. And all of a sudden, people come running into the room to make sure she's okay and that everything is fine in the room, which it, of course, was. It was just an amazing moment, because when you look back at our families, twins are not in our family at all. And of course, after tons and tons of research that my bride did, as soon as that day was over to find out how in the world this happened, we discovered that fraternal twins are the ones that are hereditary and identical, or God's way of just surprise. And it's really kind of a cool deal. But, when I think of my kiddos, and specifically my twins, and the life that they live today, I recognize their story didn't start at the time that they were born. Their story started long before that. And this is all of my children, all of your children, all of our stories started long before we ever took a breath of life here on this earth. And it's generations that have come before us of our family, our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and all of the stories that lead up to our story today, and all of the ways that our stories are going to play out in the future. Well, we're starting a new series today called Who Really Needs Christmas? And this is piggybacking on the series that we've been in of Who Really Needs God? And so when we talk about Christmas, most people are cool with God. But then when all of a sudden you start bringing things down to Jesus, that's when things begin to get a little hairy, don't they? Well, this is one of those stories that is the greatest story ever told. And we're going to get to spend some time in this story. But just like we talked about our stories not starting at our birth, the same is true when it comes to Jesus. The same is true when it comes to Christmas. The Christmas story started long before Jesus ever took a breath here on this earth. It didn't start with 2 people that couldn't find a place to have their baby. It actually started with 2 people that weren't sure they could even have a baby. It didn't start in Matthew or Luke. It actually started back in Genesis. And this Christmas story begins with Abraham. You'll see at the time his name was Abram, eventually becoming Abraham. But thousands of years before Jesus made an appearance here on this earth, there was an unbelievable promise that was given to Abram. An amazing promise that Abraham received. And as we sit here today, there's lots of our friends, lots of the people, maybe you sitting in this room right now, that simply find the Christmas story unbelievable. Simply find it completely unbelievable. But as we're going to find out, The Christmas story is believable because the backstory is so remarkable. This story that God is writing through his son Jesus, and the thousands of years that it began before and the thousands of years after this moment we know as Christmas, it is a remarkable story. And it's remarkable because it doesn't begin with the birth of Jesus. That's where we normally start the story, but it's not the moment in which Mary and Joseph are not quite sure how they got pregnant. That's not where it begins. It actually begins with a couple that couldn't get pregnant and was pretty sure that they were never going to have a baby. You see, the Christmas story is an unbelievable, incomprehensible, hard to just wrap your mind around, impossible promise. It's an amazing story that was made thousands of years before Christmas. And so when we talk about Genesis, I want to encourage you to not think of the Bible. I want you to think about this ancient document that has been preserved for thousands and thousands of years, that has survived all these translations, all of this human interpretation, and it is the same today. And the truth is the same, start to finish, as it was in the moment in which the stories began getting started. As they made their way around an oral tradition, eventually to become what we know as the Bible. God made sure that this story was preserved in a remarkable way. And so when we talk about Genesis, please understand that we're not talking about just a book in the Bible. We're talking about an ancient document that has withstood the test of time. And today is authoritative in a remarkable, amazing way in our lives. You see, God went to great lengths to ensure that his involvement would be preserved forever. It would be preserved for all eternity. And so it began like this. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you." Now for Abram, his country meant security. It meant that he was known. There were folks that knew who he was, that he was comfortable with it. He understood the culture, and he understood that there was protection to go with this country in which he was residing in. We have no idea why God chose Abram. We have no clue why he chose Abram, just like we really aren't quite sure why he chose Joseph other than his family line. But, of course, God had to start somewhere with someone. And he told Abram to leave his security, he told him to leave his family, told him to leave his territory, told him to leave everything that he knew. And he says, "I will make you into a great nation." Now understand, let's wrap our minds around this. Here's Abram, and he's 75 years old, which 75 in today is different than 75 then. Because at age 75 today, and you're thinking, "I'd like to have a baby," the chances are pretty slim today. The idea in that day is that it's very true that 75 was definitely growing older in age, but folks were living hundreds of years at this time. However, people traditionally already had begun to have children. And so they had been trying to have children, and it was learned that they were unable to conceive, and they were unable to have kids. And so they were becoming what were known as the outcasts. This was a cultural thing to where there was a stigma, there was an understanding that there was no blessing on their life, and they were becoming outcasts in a remarkable way. And so here he is at 75 years old, no kids, and God's telling him, "I'm going to make a great nation from you." And of course, Abram's got to be sitting there going, "Man, a great nation, I'd love to just be a great granddad someday. Let alone thousands and thousands and thousands of people to come from me and my wife as the starting point." God says, "I will bless you and I will make your name great." In other words, you're about to be famous, Abram. Folks are going to know your name all over the world. But Abram's sitting there he's got to be thinking, "Man, I'm just leaving everybody that I know." And so therefore, we know how this works when people move, and we know how this works when distance has a way of separating, and then all of a sudden, eventually, who was once known, eventually, is forgotten. It's what ends up happening. It's something that we don't like. It's not something that we plan, but it ends up happening. But God's telling him, "I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great." And then he says, "You will be a blessing." He tells Abram that he is going to be a blessing in a world that is full of violence, it's full of corruption. Their perspective on this violence and corruption very different than ours is today. It was a way of life. That was the norm for them. Whereas today it's different. But yet God's telling Abram, you're going to be a blessing to people, which is a foreign concept during this time. God goes on to say, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And then God just blows the doors off, as if this thought process wasn't already unbelievable. As if this thought process was not already incomprehensible, hard to imagine. Abram's sitting there going, this is crazy talk. God just ups the ante another notch. And he says, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now please understand, again, God's saying that every group, every nation, every people on this earth are going to be blessed through Abram. Now if you filter this through the culture of the time, this was a mind-blowing reality, because during this time, people didn't bless people. No people groups blessed other people groups, and no nations blessed other nations. All people, all nations were all about conquering, oppressing, enslaving. They were either conquering or being conquered. They were either killing or being killed. And this was a way of life. This is how it works. So this idea of people blessing people, and especially nations blessing nations, this was just mind-blowingly huge. However, Abraham did something amazing. And in that moment, he believed the unbelievable. He believed God. And eventually he and Sarah had a son. But even in the midst of a couple that's growing older having a son, and the amazing blessing that must have been, there wasn't a lot of blessing that was felt. There was still this angst inside. And so we see Abraham's family tree here. And see, Abraham, his family tree lines out a whole lot like your and my family tree. Just a whole bunch of messed upness. All right? I mean, that's a word. We'll use that from here on out. A whole bunch of junk in here. You got Abraham, and then Sarah, who, of course, Abraham and Sarah were not able to have a kid, so therefore they took matters into their own hands. And Sarah said, hey, Abraham, why don't you have sex with Hagar, my servant girl? Why don't you have sex with her and have a baby? We'll call that our baby. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Right? We'll call that our baby. So he messes up, and he and Sarah mess up, so therefore he's got Hagar. They have Ishmael, which Ishmael goes on to create a whole new religion. A whole new idea of faith, a whole new idea of a world religion. And so that's for another time. We'll have to talk about that another time. But Abraham and Sarah, they have Isaac, who then Isaac marries Rebekah. And Isaac and Rebekah have Esau and Jacob, which Jacob, as the youngest, ends up stealing the birthright of Esau. He ends up becoming the most important, or the first, symbolically the firstborn, over his older brother, in which that man, Jacob, eventually becomes the father that is known as Israel. It eventually becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, creating the nation of Israel. Now, Jacob ends up with 4 wives, which I'm going to tell you right now, I love my bride like crazy. I can only handle 1. I don't know how he does more than 1, but he was, man, he had 4 wives. Out of those 4 wives, he eventually has these 12 descendants, which become the nation of Israel. This is the family tree of Abraham, and it's all messed up. It reads very similar to our family trees. There is all kinds of mess in there. Isaac's younger son stealing, obviously, Esau. Jacob stealing Esau's firstborn status. Jacob's sons then selling Joseph into slavery. We know that story. Joseph into slavery. And the entire family eventually migrates to Egypt, where they become a nation of slaves. Now, fulfilling God's promise, right? Blessing. No, nobody was feeling blessed in this moment. Everybody was questioning, as we all would. God said there's going to be a blessing. You're going to bless other people. You're going to bless other nations. And they were in no position to do either. Then God sent Moses. And as God sent Moses to the scene, here it was. It was going to all change, right? But it didn't. And by the time Moses was finished, nobody in Egypt was feeling blessed either. And the story begins to continue, or the story continues to become more complicated, and more questions begin to arise. The Canaanites were not feeling blessed. There was lots and lots of killing that was taking place. Not much blessing at all. Now, something we have to remember is, and I alluded to this a while ago, Old Testament violence is not this symbol that God is not good and that God is not present. Old Testament violence simply is the evidence of a people without God. A people without God. We can look at the Old Testament violence and see it through the eyes that we see because we exist on this side of Christmas. See, before this side of Christmas, there's no grace, there's no mercy, there's no compassion, there's no unconditional love, there's none of that. But on this side of Christmas, we peer through it with different eyes. We peer through it with this understanding of serving and caring and being compassionate and entering into one another's worlds and all of those types of things, where we desire to bless the world. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but it's important we understand that the people of what we read in the Old Testament, they were functioning out of what was normal. It was expected. It happened that way. And about 1,000 years after God's promise to Abraham, Abraham's family, this nation, becomes a kingdom. And have David as the king, and he is a warrior king. David is a phenomenal warrior king, and he did exactly what the goal was. He created peace. Now, he created peace for Israel, but he didn't create peace for all the world. He created peace and security because they became the most powerful. And they had everybody else scared of them. So therefore, there is a season of peace. Well, David has a son named Solomon. Solomon becomes king, and Solomon is a builder king. So you have the warrior king, and now you have the builder king, and Israel becomes incredibly wealthy and incredibly influential. And finally, here it is. This is God's promise is about to be fulfilled. Because now the nation of Israel is in a position to finally bless the world. They're in a position of peoples blessing peoples. They're in a position of nation blessing the nations. But instead of blessing the nations, Solomon decided to marry all of the nation's daughters and worship their gods. Whoops. And here we are. You see, earlier God promised Solomon that if you worship the other gods, I will destroy the temple. Because I'm writing the bigger story anyway. God was telling a much bigger story than just this moment of time. And as any good father would do, God kept his promise to Solomon. He ended up dividing the nation and destroying the temple. And the kingdom of God had now a divided economy, had a divided military, and what seemed to be the best opportunity in this moment to fulfill this prophecy that God had given hundreds of years earlier, it seemed like this moment is now lost forever and ever. So we fast forward 300 more years. It's amazing how we can just blip 300 years like that, right? We fast forward 300 more years to 700 BC, and the northern kingdom, Israel, is completely lost. The southern kingdom, which is known as Judah, is on the verge of implosion. They are on the verge of invasion. Israel can't bless herself, much less bless anybody else. And God then speaks to the prophet Isaiah, and Isaiah writes it down, and it's preserved. Fast forward 1,200 more years of not blessing feelings. Fast forward 1,200 more years to the 8th century. Things weren't going very well. The northern kingdom had completely abandoned God, and the southern kingdom was on the verge of doing the exact same thing. Then the Assyrian king Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem, and King Hezekiah surrendered the nation as a vassal state, which means they gave loyalty to Assyria. And this story doesn't sound a whole lot like a blessing story, does it? It sounds a little bit eerily like yours and my story, where the feeling of blessing may be leaving us a bit wanting. But yet we know that God is present, or we're told that God is present. We wonder where that leaves us. Well, the story continues because Isaiah tells God's words to the people, and he says, I will make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. In which the people that hear this are going, a light? Isaiah, you've lost your ever-loving mind. God didn't say that. A light? How in the world are we supposed to be a light? We're a joke. We're a joke on this earth, and nobody's going to believe a word that we say. This is just going to make us seem crazier than we already do. Not to mention that salvation. Can you imagine being told God's salvation may reach to the ends of the earth? And you now have all of these years of history where you can't save yourself, where you don't feel like God has saved you, and you have no chance of saving anybody else. So we can put ourselves in their shoes pretty easily. The next 300 years were extremely chaotic. Amazingly chaotic. Lots of oppression. The Babylonians invaded. The temple was destroyed. The best and brightest of the nation were exiled and sent away. The economy was in shambles. The military was completely decimated. God sends another prophet, Malachi. We got to rally the troops, right? God sends another prophet, Malachi. And his words, yet again, same song, 82nd verse. Impossible, improbable, unlikely, crazy talk. You know what I mean? Whatever word you want to put in there. Inconceivable, unbelievable. God says, my name will be great among the nations. To which you can imagine. Can you imagine the people that hear this, that are a part of the people of Israel, the people of God, also outside? Can you imagine? My name will be great among the nations. That's a nice pipe dream, you bunch of losers. Right? That's exactly it. Blessed nation. God's name is going to be great. No. God's name is not going to be great. And everybody says, shut up. Stop talking like that. Your nation is pathetic. You can't feed, protect yourself. It's over. You can imagine this idea of, man, all these empty promises of God. It sure seems like it, doesn't it? All these empty promises. Lots of hype. But the truth is, Zeus's name is most likely going to be great. Alexander the Great's name. That name's going to be great. You can hear the people. You can hear the conversations. You can hear the meetings after the meetings that are taking place. You can hear this underground movement that's happening. Malachi continues, from where the sun rises to where it sets, in every place, incense and pure offerings will be brought to me, because my name will be great among the nations, says the Lord Almighty. But nobody listened. Nobody listened to these words, because why would they? All they had heard was a bunch of empty promises, and this nation had been overrun by Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and now the Greeks were on their way. And in 63 BC, Pompey the Great rode his horse into the temple to see what this God was all about. And as he entered into the holy room, there was nothing in there. These people didn't even have an image of their God. You can imagine Pompeii. What a pathetic religion. Pathetic. So Pompey took Jerusalem, annexed it to the Republic of Rome, and thus began the Roman occupation of Israel. See, the descendants of Abraham had truly become a nation. But this unbelievable, unwavering, awesome, phenomenal, hopeful blessing that was promised seemed to end right then and right there. It seemed like all the nations would not be blessed because of Israel. Israel would not be a light to the Gentiles, and the Jewish God would be anything but worshipped throughout the entire world. Because nobody was interested in a God like this God, or the way this God seemed to be. Nobody was interested in a God who couldn't protect his people. And this people was known only for being real hard-headed about their invisible, inactive God. This is a different story than you're accustomed to, isn't it? This is a different way of looking at our history. Well, everybody, I have to tell you, this is reality. And this is the truth. And we've got to look back on our lineage. We've got to look back in order for us to be able to look ahead to the things that are to come. And it's in this moment that is like so many stories. It's in this moment when all seemed lost, when all things were as hopeless as they'd ever been, when God's promise to Abraham seemed to be as far out of reach as it possibly could be, Paul records a moment to the church in Galatia, and he says, when the set time had fully come. There was a moment in time, the fullness of time, the fullness of God's timing. It always plays out differently than we think it's going to. But it always plays out better than we ever dreamed it could play out. There was an expanding empire, exporting a common Greek and Roman culture. There was this language that was becoming across the board. A highway, there was a seaport system that connected all the major population hubs of the civilized world. The Pax Romana was in place, which brought peace between the civilized and conquered nations. And there was at last a mechanism through which to get the world's attention. And in this moment, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, to a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And the angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you're to call him Jesus." Literally Yeshua or Joshua, Messiah, Savior, Deliverer. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. You see, this story plays out a whole lot like people's stories on this earth. In the end, God kept his promise. He kept his promise. This unbelievable, incomprehensible, unimaginable, seemingly impossible promise. God kept it. He kept it to Abraham. And the events that surround this first Christmas, we now can look back and say, these are not so hard to believe now that we know the backstory. Now that we see the fullness of this story beginning to play out, and we have the privilege of thousands of years of history since that first Christmas to look and see what life has played out like since then. You see, all the nations truly would be blessed through Abraham. Israel truly would be a light to the Gentiles, and the Jewish God truly would be worshipped throughout all of the world. And so everybody, the thing that makes the Christmas story so believable is that the backstory is so remarkable. This is what makes it so believable, because the backstory is so remarkable. The backstory is your and my story, is it not? It's our families. It's our dysfunction. It's our messed upness. And we can relate to this. The backstory is so remarkable. And this backstory gives you and me hope, doesn't it? Doesn't it give us hope that not all is lost? It may seem like it. It may seem like God is uninvolved, and it may seem like he's distant. It may seem like he doesn't care. But the reality is he cares greatly. And just as he says to Mary, you are highly favored, he says the same words to you and me. And it's a beautiful truth. Guys and gals, the Christmas story began thousands of years before the first Christmas. And it continues to be written thousands of years after. this series we've launched a question. And the question is, who really needs Christmas? The answer is the world did. The answer is that the conquering, evil, violent, awful reality of the world, whenever God chose to send Jesus in that perfect timing, the world needed Jesus. The world needed Christmas. And as we look at our stories and we see what may be this feeling or this thought process of this is going to end really badly, I'm going to be a loser, this story gives us hope. This story helps us see that in the end, you matter. That God's promises that we read in Scripture and we tell through the years of the ways that He's impacted lives, it's a true story. And no matter what your circumstances are, no matter what your life situation looks like today, God truly is active. Whether you feel like He is or not, He truly is interested. He's interested in you and He's interested in me. And whenever our circumstances argue to the contrary, the reality is God can be trusted. He can be trusted. With your life, with your kids' lives, with my life, with our lives together. But the story doesn't end there. Because as it turns out, it wasn't just the world that needed Christmas. God needed Christmas too. Can you believe that? God needs Christmas too. He needed Christmas. We're going to talk about that next week. Father, I thank You for today. I thank You so much, Father, for the way that You have orchestrated, that You have put together, that You have been present when for thousands of years it seemed like You weren't. And there were moments in time where it seemed like You might be, but then the overwhelmingly engulfing of the years that seemed like you were away. The truth is, You saw things that no human on this earth ever could. And You were able to foretell, You were able to see the future in ways that we never can. And You were able to save the world in the perfect way. Father, may we today realize that we don't get to save the world. Our best and brightest and most amazing dreams that we can paint about the future pale in comparison to what You're doing. And so, Father, while this story can make us feel so small, Father, will You help this story to do quite the opposite? To help us to see that You care deeply about each and every one of us in this room. That You long for each and every one of us to know that You care deeply. And for us to open our minds, to open our hearts, to open our very lives to the fact that You see what's going on in ways that we can't. So, Father, will You help us to trust You today? And Lord, as we look back on history, may that give us hope for the future. We pray these things in the saving name of Jesus. Amen.